Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight. I've been with RICS for over 11 years now, and I sit within the Standards Regulatory and Thought Leadership part of the organisation, with my role looking at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment, and with over 110,000 qualified members working right across the property life cycle through land, planning and development, brokerage, construction, operations, building maintenance, end of life, property management. It's a really broad canvas upon which we need to take advantage of data and technology in all its forms. And indeed, our members work right across the different asset types, whether it's land itself, residential property, commercial, alternative and infrastructure. So a really important area for us to look at as a professional body. And indeed, as we have this discussion now in the early autumn of 2020 with the crisis around energy costs, it's particularly relevant, I think, today to be talking to Stewart Little from IRT Surveys. So Stewart, please do join me.
Morning, Andrew.
Morning to you. And I guess before we go into the detail of the discussion we're having, it'd be great to hear a bit of your backstory and the origin story of IRT Surveys for those who haven't seen our previous discussions.
Sure, I'll try not to send your listeners to sleep. IRT is coming up for its 21st birthday next year. My background was architecture. I did 5 years in private practice architecture as a technician. I then moved on to sell flat roofs and roof gardens for a company called Bowder. And it was in that time with Bowder that I realised you didn't have to cut core samples in a flat roof to diagnose, trapped moisture. So I sat down with a friend of mine who was the only businessman I knew at the time who'd set up his own company. It was a chap called Dave Jones. Dave quite famously wrote a computer game called Lemmings in the 90s, and then went on to write Grand Theft Auto. I basically sat down with Dave and said, look, I'd like to set up my own company. Normally what I do is work with RICS surveyors. I find surveyors that have flat roof problems. I go on a roof. I ask them, permission, can I please do a free survey? But then ultimately you're doing a destructive test. You're getting a blowtorch out, risking burning down the building with a blowtorch. You're invalidating guarantees.
Yeah.
And you're a salesman. You're not a flat roofing, core sampling expert. I always felt a little bit guilty when I cut holes in clients' roofs. So anyway, long story short, Dave Jones gave me enough investment to go and buy the best camera we could on the market, to buy myself a car. And we set up talking to RICS surveyors, surveying flat roofs. And very quickly, the penny dropped that there was very little point driving all the way from Dundee, which is where we're based, to, say, Manchester, to do a roof survey and not take pictures of the whole building envelope. So we did the whole building envelope. Then the penny dropped that I was an architect type dude. My brother's a scientist, he's in the business, and Dave Jones is a programmer. Could we somehow turn pixels into pounds and literally add value to those images? So we went from being a roofing surveying company to a building envelope surveyor to an energy specialist in about 3 years. Then we wrote software in 2006 that quantified the pixels and said, look, here's the money, the carbon and the kilowatts you're wasting. But then the feedback we got from clients was, that's great, you've gone from pretty pictures to a better story. But the feedback we got was, what you're now doing is you're very accurately describing, we definitely have a headache. What's the aspirin? So then we raised more venture capital and we wrote software that basically automates retrofit decision making. And now, just 2 weeks ago, we actually managed to sell the company to Mears PLC. So we can now bring data analytics, we can bring funding, and we can now do the contracting from end to end. So the last time we spoke, Andrew, I had 8 staff here at IRT. Now I'm part of a 5,500 staff PLC, which hasn't sunk in yet.
And as you say, it's giving you that opportunity to really look at the process. And I shouldn't use the phrase birth to death because that sounds a bit negative, but as you see it through all the way from diagnosis to plan to actually contract and actually do the work, which I think is a powerful tool. Now, I know today we want to talk about something called the North Star project. Could you give me a bit of background on what that project's about and what it's trying to do?
Yeah, certainly. That's a project we're involved in the northeast of England, looking at a housing association's portfolio. So lots of housing associations have been talking about doing things for years, and it is quite a conservative, risk-averse sector. So people tend to talk about it and think about it for quite a while, and then they tend to get tied in procurement knots as to when they make a decision. We're going to buy this piece of software. We're going to get into a contracting relationship. The contract, it can take about 2 years to get to a point where you're actually live. So what we're doing with Northstar invested in our DRIAM software, which is our cloud-based analytics platform. And they then asked us to get involved in helping them physically do works. So we're in a small consortium with a contractor called Cara in Manchester, Cara EPS. We put together a program of works in conjunction with Northstar and in direct liaison with a contractor, and we brought them funding, and we're now on site for about 2 years, helping them do things like change the light bulbs, put draft proofing in, do the lofts, do external wall insulation, do underfloor insulation, put external wall insulation on, decarbonise the heating system, but also bring them grant funding. So I don't know if it's the Scotsman in me, Andrew, but I just hate leaving a grant pound lying
unused. Yeah.
So we overturn every stone looking for grant funding, and try and optimize the funding and optimize the works themselves and help them get to net zero.
And what's the sort of scope here in terms of, at the end of the day, we I suppose we need to talk about the number of homes, the number of dwellings involved. What's the scale and duration of this?
It's about a 2-year program, and it's about 1,000 houses. So we're on site right now doing the first 200 or 300, but it's quite it's addressed the low-hanging fruit first, and then go for the slightly harder. But all of our clients have a target of hitting C, an EPC of C by 2030. So that's first and foremost, that's the target, is how do we get to C, and how do we do it affordably, and can we time those retrofits with the program of repair and maintenance? And when we've got voids, can we do it in a pragmatic manner that doesn't disturb the tenant 2 or 3 times?
And what are there challenges around either? Well, I suppose, in some respects, if it's a fairly homogeneous building stock, then presumably there's that element of repeatability, if that's a correct word. But is it quite a varied housing stock? And I guess there's always, issues around condition and exact location, although it's clearly in one particular part of the UK. What does it feel like in terms of that variability and therefore the different kinds of interventions?
That's a very good question. The social housing, well, for this particular client, they've maybe got about 20 different archetypes. So it's not as varied as the general population for housing. You tend to get semi-detached or terraced houses that are generally all 2 or 3 bedroom. It's fairly repetitious, as you say. The interventions, there really are only 3 things you can do, Andrew. It's either retrofit the house, so it's either use less energy, make your own energy, or use it more efficiently. And that's the basic ethos. We've got this fabric first approach to say, look, let's think of your buildings like leaky buckets. Think of the energy as water going into that bucket. Let's not pour nice, clean, renewable energy in to a fabric that's full of holes. But if you've got numerous holes in the bucket, there's very little point in sticking your finger in one hole, because it just increases the pressure in the other holes. So we're trying to look at it in a holistic manner and do as many things as practically possible on each house in turn. But the program of works goes data in the top of the funnel, validate the data, crunch it, sanitize it, map it, model it, run it through the latest version of SAP, compare it to the EPC register, and then get the client to agree this is the starting point. So that if that net zero is a journey, we need to agree the origin and the destination, and then let a sat nav almost program the route. That's where we are with Northstar. Well, that's where we were about a year ago. We then embarked on a thermal imaging campaign to say, look, the data says those cavities were filled in 2002. But are they? Did they do all 3 elevations on that semi-detached? And did they truly fill them? Because I'm sure every RICS surveyor that's watching this will have seen half-filled cavities, badly filled cavities, cold bridging. So we did that with thermal imaging just to say, look, there's actually more grant funding than you think. But I'm sorry, I'm waffling here, Andrew, but that that always raises a problem for us, because you're admitting to the absolute truth. You know, if your head's in the sand saying they're all cavity filled, they've got an EPC of C, they're fine. A quick thermal image can say, hang on, that's why you've got a disrepair claim, that's why you've got mold growth, it's only half filled. It's actually wet insulation that's worse than no insulation in terms of energy efficiency.
So I guess, to be blunt, what you're saying, Stuart, is that if you don't have that kind of brutal reality check at the start with some thermal imaging, you don't get a true view of the bucket, to use your analogy of a bucket with holes in or whatever. So, you know, if we don't start with this kind of reality check, despite what the EPC might say, despite what the history of that property might imply in terms of work that's been done in the past, that, as you say, was either done, dare I say it, not very well, or has been damaged by some kind of, you know, succeeding work, that thermal imaging has to be your kind of first port of call?
Yeah, it's a really fast, easy tool in the box, Andrew. I mean, I honestly think every RICS surveyor should have a thermal camera in his toolkit. But it's a £20 per elevation survey that we do.
Mm.
It's a bit special. It's nighttime only. It's 2 or 3 hours after sundown. It's heating
Right.
on. It's dry. It's low wind. It's a bit Goldilocks
Yeah.
in that regard. But it helps steer a proper surveyor. If we're not proper, I'm talking about you guys. It helps steer that retrofit assessment, the retrofit coordination, the technical survey, the RICS inspection, the condition report. It can help guide it and optimize that as well, to say, look, if you're going to boroscope these houses, please do these ones and put the boroscope right there, because we think there's missing insulation.
And I guess, I suppose, it's an obvious comment to make, but you know, when you take the kind of purest definition of data as opposed to information, you obviously start with that, as you say, that Goldilocks type approach of having some fairly standard conditions, so you know you've got a kind of a consistent way of looking at that leaky bucket. What's that next step? And you've obviously talked about the software you've written, but what's that next step to turn that raw data into something which is very kind of prosaic and practical in terms of, well, what do we now do? What does that look like, that journey from data to information?
Yeah, well, that's a brilliant question. That's where we are with several clients at the moment, Andrew. I mean, as I said at the top of the call, we've been doing this for 20 years. It's only in the last year or two that people have said to us, we want to do a program of works, help. So we're now kind of rolling up our sleeves in a bit of a consultative role to say, well, we can bring you funding. So money's always a problem. You know, if we create a program of works that say, look, we've analysed all the data, we've done the thermal imaging, we've found all the problems, we've quantified it, you need 7.8 million or 700 million, you know, whatever if they're trying to get to net zero, we are talking in those sort of quantums of hundreds of million. We can now say to them, look, there's a pie chart here. We can bring you a third of that as off-balance sheet debt. We can bring a third of it from grant funding, but your capex is going to be X over Y years. But then we do need to engage with, again, proper surveyors and a contractor to work out the cost per square metre of external wall insulation or air source heat pumps. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but those things have gone up in price quite a lot lately. So things you priced last year are completely different this year. So it's just trying to get people to move quickly enough to take advantage of the economies of scale we can bring if they do a nice big project. Because I think the time for these pilots is over.
Indeed. And as you mentioned at the top of the call, obviously you're now part of a much bigger group, but I guess with things like North Star and indeed many projects, you're going to be working with lots of other partners to deliver projects at scale. And I guess that brings both benefits perhaps and frustrations. I mean, how's that working, particularly with something like North Star, where what are the other kind of stakeholders as well as the final, you know, housing association itself? What kind of people are you having to work with and communicate and get this information to and back and forth from?
Yeah, well, we've got a little consortium that has an RICS surveyor in it called Michael Holden. So for any of the RICS element of it, we deploy Michael to site. He actually posted something on LinkedIn this morning. It was a brilliant example of what thermal imaging can't do. He posted a photograph of just underfloor in a house in the Solent, where he'd taken a 360-degree camera and he found all these rotten joists. The floor was on the brink of collapse. That's the sort of thing from the outside, we would never see that with a thermal camera. And with the best will in the world, doing a retrofit, without those experienced eyes and someone looking under the floor and in the attic void, you can't ascertain the true condition. So there's still a role for that sort of partner in any bid like this. Any project needs an RICS experienced pair of eyes steering it.
Indeed, and you also alluded to the various, sources of finance. You obviously talked about, the balance sheet of the housing association itself and various grants. I mean, what does that landscape look like now? And as you said, you hate to leave any kind of grant unused. But what does the landscape look like now? And as you also mentioned, unfortunately, we've got just at the wrong time, we've got increases in prices, both in terms of labour and materials and specific things like heat pumps. What does that landscape look like now in terms of how people can finance this, either at perhaps an individual owner occupier or at scale for a housing association?
How long is this podcast? It's very difficult to describe, Andrew. We have things like, I'm not boring you to death here, right? We've got ECO, which is the energy company obligation. That's been around for a long time. It's now in its 4th iteration. But within ECO, there are things like, well, out with ECO, sorry, you've got HUG, the home upgrade grants. That's relatively new, people are getting used to it. In the past, we've had things like EEC, EISH, CERT, CESP, HEAPS, NEEPS, REAPS, SEEPS. There are so many funding schemes out there. It's one of the reasons we wrote this DREAM software that's kind of constantly advertised behind me. It's so fluid, it's very difficult for a human being to stay on top of it. So we've now got a lot of the social housing people are going for SHDF funding, which is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. That wave 2 is out imminently, and everyone is scrabbling around creating projects and going after, I think the fund's about £800–900 million to do it. And that's coming, it's £4 billion over 10 years. And everyone's gearing up to try and claw that as much as they can. Bays are getting a little bit frustrated that people keep submitting little projects of 50 houses, 10 houses. So the best way to do that sort of funding scheme is in consortium. If you can get 10 or 12 small housing associations working collaboratively, cleanse the data together and go for a big chunk of money, that's what Bays are looking for. But out with Bays SHDF funding, ECO and HUG are 2 of the biggest. But for you and I, if you lived in Scotland, there is an interest-free loan you can get to do anything on your house, anything that improves the energy efficiency. There's an interest-free loan. In England, it's different.
And in Scotland, is that underwritten by the Scottish government, or how's that actually work? What's the source of that capital?
Yeah, well, I guess it's taxpayer is the ultimate answer, but it's an interest-free loan. It's unsecured, and the only criteria is whatever you do needs to pay for itself within the term of the loan. It's a bit of an arduous process to actually get your hands on the money, Andrew, but I did it. I put PV on my garage and put batteries in my garage, and it cost £8,000. I'm paying it back over 10 years, and I think it cost about £68 a month. But it made my energy bill go from, I think my electricity bill was about £75, and it dropped to £15. Which, I mean, 75 wasn't much. I'm quite savvy in my consumption. But now during the summer, it's £15 is tremendous.
Indeed, so, as you say, but because that very much makes sense, and particularly with the interest-free element as well. And I guess a lot of the time we focus on, quite understandably, just the simple pounds and pence arithmetic of retrofit saves money, reduces bills. But what are the wider benefits? Because clearly there's a lot of social value and social good that comes out of this whole kind of process. How do you see those, particularly at scale, when you're working with things like the North Star project?
Yeah, well, it's job creation as well. There's lots of facets and reasons to do it. So some of our clients are passionate, let's save the planet clients. And you think, well, that's admirable. We have to live on this planet forever, so we need to look after it. So I'm fully on board with the Greta Thunbergs of this world trying to do a bit to save the planet. But equally for the money men, this is about protecting their assets. You know, if you don't retrofit these homes, you won't be able to sell them or rent them or lease them in the future. Because that's the way the legislation's going, is like in commercial buildings, you know, you can't rent a building if it's an E, F or G, you have to improve it. That's coming to you and I's houses in coming years, without doubt. But also on the ground, you're creating jobs from someone who's able to clear an attic. So we're working with like ex-soldiers and things that can't find work. We're working with them via CARA to let them empty attics and do loft insulation, which is great. But you're also working with people who are surveyors, who've retrained to become retrofit assessors and retrofit coordinators, because you need that to become PAS compliant. You can't draw down the funding unless it's done in a PAS 2035 compliant manner. So you're creating jobs at that end. You're also creating jobs for, you know, surveyors. You're creating jobs for programmers. It is a nice green virtuous circle. Even the bankers and the money men, you're creating jobs. So it's win-win no matter which way you look at the retrofit market.
Indeed.
The only downside is it costs money.
I guess one final thought and question, and what are your thoughts on this, is, you know, clearly it's an eye-watering challenge, this to retrofit, you know, residential dwellings in the UK, and clearly it's great that we're seeing things like the North Star project from a kind of social housing perspective. What sort of lessons and hopefully kind of almost scalability do you think we're going to get from these larger projects of particularly social housing, when it's coming to building the kind of capabilities and skills and supply chain that we need, that will then have a really positive effect about picking off these individual homes? Because, you know, I think there must be a lot of lessons and a lot of sort of resource and skill building that we can get from these larger scale projects that can then really provide, you know, the eye-watering kind of infrastructure we need to do this at scale for a lot of the owner-occupied stuff.
Yeah, the owner-occupiers is a difficult market, definitely. Well, in some ways it's easier to work with a landlord with social housing, because they can make decisions on 10,000 houses, which is great. But what you find in that sector is beholden's not the right word. They're so respectful and mindful of the tenants that if the tenant objects to anything, they can't do it. So we lost three houses we were retrofitting. One tenant said, "I don't want you to move my Christmas tree that's in the attic, so you're not insulating my attic." But without insulating the attic, we couldn't get the house to 50 kilowatt hours per square metre, which meant we couldn't fulfil the Bayes criteria. So they just had to be scratched off the list. Then we had another householder who asked about the cost of running an extractor fan, and we were installing vent axia fans, and they gave us all the numbers and the science and the mathematics behind it and said, on average, it costs 1 pence a day. And that person pulled out of the contract. So we were looking to reduce their energy bill by 90%. But for £3.65, they said, "I don't want to pay for that extractor fan." So that sector has its own challenges, Andrew. It's not they don't just say to the tenants, "You're doing this, that's it." There are things. I'm on a steering group with the Green Finance Institute, creating green rental agreements. I'm trying to get them to change the name to the Green Rental Energy Tenancy Agreement, just so I can get Greta. But so I'm just going to call it a Greta agreement. If we had Greta agreements for tenants, then that takes on 4.5 million private rented houses and 4.5 million social houses. So you could get access across 9 million rented houses, and then not force a retrofit upon them, but just be able to do it in a nice economic manner. Because I mean, you're a surveyor yourself. It's so expensive to get to site, set up porta cabins, do the risk assessment, the method statement, go through the procurement process, hire the scaffolding. To just do one house is cost prohibitive. We need to do an area-based scheme and say we are doing all of Leeds, or let's do all of Salford, or whatever the area is. Let's just do it in an area-based way. And that appeals to the manufacturers of the air source heat pumps, It appeals to the Kenses of this world that are doing, you know, district heating systems. It appeals to the guys like Mears, my colleagues, who are now saying that we want to gear up to do 500 houses, not 5. That's we need to just do that from north to south. Just, I say north to south. That sounded very Scottish, didn't it? Sorry. Focus on my country first. We're cold. If we could just do that in a nice, pragmatic, data-driven way, that makes sense to me, Andrew, and just benefit from that economy of scale.
Indeed, indeed. Well, as ever, it's been fascinating to talk, Stuart. And I guess, as I say, as we chat at the end of summer, beginning of autumn 2020, with the the energy crisis so much in people's minds, I'm sure that this, ironically, will drive even more activity, hopefully, to make sure we can crack some of these problems and use the data and technology that's already out there to help support it. But for today, fascinating chat as ever, and I look forward to chatting again soon, Stuart.
Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, Andrew.
Pleasure.